it's caused by a fungus. Talk a lot about the fungus. And we have a situation where this fungus can infect, colonize, and kill healthy trees. There doesn't need to be any predisposition, any type of weakening of the tree for the oak wilt fungus to do its damage. And that's kind of unusual. Now, some of you may have heard of disease, Dutch elm disease, for example. Anybody ever heard of Dutch elm disease before? Yeah. That's another good example of a one pathogen, one host relationship where the pathogen can infect and kill a healthy tree. Chestnut blight is another one. A lot of people have heard of chestnut blight. Same thing. But once you get past that, especially in Texas, there are not that many fungi that can do that. We just picked one up over in East Texas that's been spreading from Georgia since 2008 that kills sassafras and red bay trees. It's extremely virulent. We have a situation there where it's a one pathogen, one host relationship. Most of the things that kill trees in the hill country are very different than that. For example, we have canker-causing diseases. We have certain root rots that kill trees out here. But those are the kinds of pathogens that actually require a weakened host. The physiology of the host becomes weakened. The trees become depleted of their resources that they utilize to respond to the stresses and pathogens they're exposed to. And as a result of that, we get tree mortality. We call those the declines. And I don't know if there's any old timers in here that know when we used to call oak wilt oak decline out here in the hill country. When I got here in '81, it was called oak decline. And I still run into people that say, well, that oak decline is worse than the oak wilt, isn't it? And I have to go through a whole explanation about what a decline is. It's a situation where you have a tree is exposed to environmental stresses like drought, and as a result of prolonged exposure to drought, the tree depletes its resources, and it can't then respond to pests and pathogens that normally do them no harm whatsoever. So I'd just like to emphasize to people, I get accused of, geez, Appel, that's all you ever talk about is oak wilt. Well, that's all I ever get asked to talk about is oak wilt. So especially here in the hill country. And so therefore, it seems like I kind of focused on oak wilt, and I did indeed spend most of my career working on oak wilt. But nonetheless, just keep in mind that there are a whole lot of other topics that I could go on for hour after hour after hour, but today you're just going to get a dose of oak wilt. And how are we doing?
Perfect.
We're ready to go? Debbie, why don't you?
Let's just go ahead and get into it.
Okay, we're going to go ahead and get into it. So I'll just give one little bit on my background. I got to Texas A&M in 1981. And I drove up and down Route 46 in the early 80s, hundreds of times during my first few years here. I, like a lot of you, have progressively cursed the traffic and the population increase and the loss of some of my favorite old places to eat and convenience stores that aren't there anymore. But I have spent a lot of time in Comal County, Kendall County, Bandera County, out here setting up research plots. I have a research plot going on down west of Bernie that I'm going to be out tomorrow morning looking at some oak wilt control plots that we put in 3 years ago. So, and part of my job has been research, but another part of my job is extension. Going out and talking about the research that we do here. And so a lot of what you're going to be looking at today is a result of research that we've done on Oak Wilt, Texas since '81. And then a lot of it is also going to be based on research that was done in other states from the time that Oak Wilt was first discovered in 1941 in Wisconsin. So when I got here in '81, I had the benefit of 40 years of research before that really helped us out a whole lot. So with that as an introduction, and I put down all my tools. Okay, let's talk about this first introduction of Oak Wilt. 1941 in Wisconsin. We think after looking at the situation, Oak Wilt had probably been killing trees in Wisconsin since the 1890s. And just by looking at old records of mortality. And as you can see here, there was a discovery of a tree disease in the 1930s in Austin by somebody from the Texas Agricultural Experiment Station. And they said that whatever it was wiping out trees, and they thought it was a root rot disease. And so that's where it kind of simmered for the next 40 years or so, until we kind of came along and said, okay, we need to look at this root rot idea. We need to quit calling it decline, because it appears that we have in Texas plain old garden variety Oak Wilt. This is just a publication from Michigan. Michigan State's doing a lot of research right now on Oak Wilt. And you can see where all these states that have Oak Wilt, and this is the range of the disease, the current range of the disease, pretty much in the United States. Most of these states do have either very minor research programs or a very robust research programs going on. Oak Wilt, since it was first discovered up in the north central states, there are still several areas up in there where the disease is very epidemic. It's spreading, killing lots of trees. My home state over here in West Virginia, you can see there are only 2 counties in West Virginia that don't have Oak Wilt. The other 53 counties in the state all have had recorded Oak Wilt centers. I am told that Oak Wilt isn't as serious up and down the Appalachian Mountains anymore. As a matter of fact, people, when they want to take people out and show them the disease, sometimes they even have a hard time trying to find it. And I imagine we could probably drive within a quarter mile of here and maybe find a little bit of Oak Wilt if we look real hard. New York State has actually, it's broken out on Long Island, and there are 2 other locations in New York State where it seems to be spreading a little bit. So it's still a very dynamic disease. But I would have to say that we are probably experiencing more losses to Oak Wilt than any other state. I'm going to talk a little bit about why that's the case. And by the way, if you have any questions, I prefer to just go ahead and do them when you have them in your mind. So if something comes up that you want to ask about, if there's anything that you think I'm wrong on, and you want to talk about it, by all means, just put your hand up or shout out my name. Here we go. All right. Yes, sir.
Yes, I noticed the brochure that mainly talk about live oak and red oak.
Yes.
Are there any varieties of oak that's not subject to this?
Yes, there are. Now, there's no oak species that is immune to Oak Wilt. Every member of the genus Quercus, which is in the family of trees called the Fagaceae, which is actually the beech family. Beeches and oak trees are somewhat related. So the genus Quercus can be broken down into very broad groups of oak. Now, we talked about red oak. That would be like the hill country red oak or blackjack oak. We've got the live oak, which is kind of an odd group. And then we have white oaks like post oak.
Water oak.
And bur oak, a bur oak is actually a white oak, but it does have some susceptibility to Oak Wilt. But in general, bur oaks, post oaks, lacy oaks, shin oak, all of those different oak species are in the white oak group. And as a result of that, they do carry resistance genes to the Oak Wilt fungus.
Okay. The 2 oaks that I'm wondering about, one is what we call the water oak over in East Texas. I mean, the thing has like
Water oak's a red oak.
Yeah,
It's
okay.
susceptible.
I never saw it over there. I mean, I
Oak
only
Wilt?
lived there about three years.
Well, Oak Wilt doesn't occur in East Texas.
Okay. Maybe
So you're not going to see it over there. You get down in and around Brenham, and there's a fair amount of red oak in there, and we do see red oak. There's an outbreak that's been going on for years that does infect a red oak, or I mean a water oak occasionally.
So is it the soil pH that keeps it from spreading to? yeast?
Absolutely not. No, soil pH is not going to influence the disease. We are pretty certain that it has to do with the species mix of trees. I mean, when you drive around out here, you all are well aware of the fact that we see thousands and thousands of acres of live oak over huge expanses. We're talking about a very typical vector-borne pathogen here, that when we have large expanses of a single species of an organism and they're all crowded together, then therefore the pathogen can spread very easily from one tree to the next. We don't have that in East Texas. We have a mixture of pine trees, loblolly and slash pine. There are many other types of oak species, and there's sweet gums and bald cypress. And because of that species mix, there's an attribute of the forest called functional diversity, which suppresses spread of diseases. We think that's one of the things at play there. And also the vectors are different. The kinds of insects that they have over there are different than the species of insect that we have out here. So, and you can see, I mean, there are plenty of oaks in New York, and it's taken decades for it to start encroaching into New York. There are plenty of oaks over here in the coastal plain of Virginia and North Carolina that you can see there's not much oak wilt there. You come over to East Texas right here, and we don't have it there. And we think that it's due to the incursion of the pine trees there that keep it from spreading as rapidly as it does elsewhere. I'm going to come back to that point in just a minute. If we look closely at the range in Texas, you can see the majority of it has always been west of I-35. But as time goes by, we pick up another county over here, and it only takes one confirmed record of the pathogen in a county that we go ahead and paint it onto the map. You can see Harris County, for example, the easternmost county down there. We could take Harris County off, and then we'd have to put it on again. We take it off and we put it on again, and so now we just go ahead and leave it on. And we think it's primarily due to people bringing firewood down from the hill country into Harris County and in the Houston area, but not just in Houston itself. You do get a lot of that, and we think every once in a while you get an outbreak, they clear it up, and then we used to take it off the map, but now we just leave it on. U.S. Forest Service always wants us to take them off, but they're not in control. We are, so we're going to go ahead and leave it on. And then we have these population centers out here. Amarillo has a small outbreak of oak wilt that they can't seem to get a handle on. Lubbock's got a fair amount of oak wilt, and part of the reason for that is they use a lot of red oaks in Lubbock as shade trees. And it would take a wholesale eradication effort to get rid of it in those communities, and we could do that, but the citizens would probably object to us coming into their yards and cutting their trees down and saying you aren't allowed to plant red oak anymore. That would take care of it, but that's just not an approach that we find very palatable. So if you look at the range map in a little bit of a different perspective, we can see that the counties that are light yellow have a very light infestation of the pathogen, and then the ones with the dark brown are the ones that have a very highly intense amount of oak wilt. Now, this doesn't minimize the fact that if somebody in Brazos County gets oak wilt in their front yard, it's devastating to them. It's no different there than it is here. It's just that we don't have a lot of oak wilt centers in Brazos County relative to Hayes, Travis, all the counties out here in the hill country. And these data are actually, unfortunately, a little old. This program was stopped by the Forest Service. This is the Texas Forest Service that did this. This is a very time-consuming thing to do. And as time has gone by, they've had to drop this program. Just can't keep it up. So why is Oak Wilt? Why is it I get called out to talk about Oak Wilt so much? Except in 2011, I was called out to talk about drought for several years. Since February of last year, I get to talk about freeze damage a whole lot right now. So it's a great job. Things keep shifting around. But the reason it's really devastating in Texas is that we have a problem with it in urban environments as well as rural environments. So you take West Virginia. I grew up in the fourth biggest city in the States, 50,000 people. Urban expansion in West Virginia is not a big problem. And therefore, the majority of the oak wilt they have there is out on the farms and on the mountainsides. And people just don't get all that worked up about it because it doesn't have a big impact on property values like it does here. So this is one reason. It's damage is also done to lots of different what we call ecosystem services. For example, regardless of your opinion about it, the golden-cheeked warbler is a presence in the hill country. And has had a pretty significant impact on people's ability to change their landscapes a lot. And we have done 2 separate studies that have shown that oak wilt does have a very serious impact on the breeding and feeding habits of the golden-cheeked warbler. We suspect it's also through anecdotal evidence. We don't have any experimental evidence, but in those areas where we get a lot of mortality, we also see changes in water tables and watersheds, that sort of thing, as the trees are eliminated. So we have that impact as well. And then also it's considered devastating here in Texas is because oak trees are widely acknowledged as a very valuable cultural resource. All you have to do is look at the state seal and see when they originally designed it, they put an oak wreath on it, along with an olive wreath on the state seal. The oaks have always been an important part of people's cultural experience in Texas. And so therefore you put all these things together. And again, this is one of the reasons why I get asked to talk about oak wilt a lot. These 2 pictures, photographs right here, were taken in 1981. That's why they look so bad. It was old Kodachrome film in those days, and then it turns kind of a blue tint over the years on the slides. But you can see this. This is in West Travis County, West Austin. And you can see the loss of this oak tree forced this guy to become a shadeless tree mechanic out front here and had to put an umbrella up. This shot was in Kerrville, and although you can't see it in the background there are 5-gallon buckets hanging in the tree. This is in 81. And according to the homeowner, they were utilizing a treatment that was being marketed by a company out of Chicago in Texas to treat trees for oak decline. And this guy was so happy because he was so thrilled with how good his live oaks look. And that's when I knew, boy, this is going to be a big job. If that's a good looking tree, and every one of them's gone now. They eliminated them. Within a few years, all those trees died anyway. So let's talk for a minute about why oak wilt is epidemic in the hill country. And this also relates to your question about why it doesn't seem to be in East Texas. It's because we've learned back in the 1950s in the mid-Atlantic states that oak wilt seemed to be peculiar to areas where the tree population had a certain community structure to it with regard to the species of oaks that were there. And anytime you disturbed that community structure and the resulting population that kind of came up after that, it could be vulnerable to oak wilt. And so it turns out that that fits very well with what has happened in the hill country over the past 200 years. The hill country was primarily grassland, and with islands of oak trees and junipers, more isolated. It was a true savanna. That's why there were so many, why the buffalo were so prominent in the hill country 150 years ago. And as a result of changing the land use from that natural native grassland to a more of a farming and ranching economy, it also changed the way the land was made use of, utilized, let's say. We start fencing it off, we start altering grazing patterns. We go from, for example, going from cattle to goats, which will pull everything out by the roots. And we start losing a lot of that native grassland. And we also allow the live oak to begin to encroach onto that land. There's one other component in there too. We started controlling wildfire. And live oaks don't like wildfire, and therefore the fire kept them in smaller populations. But once we change that land use pattern and the trees begin to spread across the landscape, we're going to talk about that, why that's also important from an oak wilt susceptibility standpoint. Once those trees start spreading across the landscape, we create the conditions that are going to allow the epidemic to get going. Same thing happened in West Virginia when the chestnut trees were eliminated from the mountains. Oak trees came up after the chestnuts were killed by chestnut blight. And then we created the conditions for oak wilt. Northern Wisconsin, northern Minnesota, logging, widespread. Clear cutting and logging resulted in removal of one species of trees that allowed the oaks to come up afterwards. And therefore you have an oak wilt epidemic. So as a result of that, we have a situation here that fire control, overgrazing, and selective removal of non-oak species has created I hate to sound trite, the perfect storm for a tree disease like this to occur. So don't take it personally. And I often tell people that, you know, it's very, very, very hard to control oak wilt. And it's because we are trying to manipulate forces that are much greater than we are to our pleasure. It's just a very difficult thing to do. It can be done. We have the tools to do so, but it is not easy. It requires resources, it requires time, and a commitment that a lot of times people just aren't willing to use. Okay, so let's get down to talking about the tree disease. So I like to couch the discussion of oak wilt in the context of what we call the disease triangle. And we use this in plant pathology to teach about plant diseases all the time. And what we're saying with the disease triangle is for a diseased plant to occur, like we have at the center of the triangle right here, we have to have a host, naturally. We have to have a pathogen, okay? But we also have to have a favorable environment. If you do not have these three components at the right proportions in a given environment, then a lot of times the disease will not develop. And it may be around and cause a little bit of damage here and there, but it's not going to become epidemic, which is what we have here with oak wilt in the hill country. Host, pathogen, and environment. So, so we're dealing with a single virulent biotic pathogen in this case. Virulent, I mean that it can infect and kill healthy hosts. But I like to point out on this one that each of these components does influence the other. And once the epidemic gets rolling, it just makes matters worse by the interaction between those three factors. So in our case, we've got Retiella fagacearum. This is the name of the fungus. We're going to talk about that. We've got the Quercus species. We're going to talk about that. And we're going to talk about the influence of temperature and moisture on the disease. So let's take a look at the fungus first. Now, I'm not putting all these names up here just to torture you. But I am putting them up there to make a point. As technology changes, we learn more about a pathogen. And as a plant pathologist, like I said, I got out here in '81, the year I got my PhD, and the name keeps changing because the technology of better understanding the organism changes. we get a better perspective on it, and therefore we have to recategorize these organisms occasionally. And when we recategorize them, we have to give them new names, because names usually reflect attributes about the pathogen. But for example, this one right here, I said that oak trees are in the Fagaceae. Well, there's the root word Fagaceae right there in the species name of the fungus. And the first guy who ever discovered the fungus, his name was grafts. Notice we didn't use any of that information. Well, we used Fagaceae there. Here we had Quercina in the name, but it keeps changing. These are microscopic views of Bracciella right here. I'll call your attention to spores. This fungus is typical of most fungi, true fungi, in that it spreads by means of spores. We have two different spore types right here. You can look at them, a microscopic view, and see that these are kind of rectangular and long. These are more oblong, rounded on the end. These are two distinct different types of spores, and each one of them does occur in nature. If we look at this rectangular one right here, this is usually the one we find inside the tree. If we do histology and look at the diseased tissues underneath the microscope, these are the kinds of spores we will usually see right here, as opposed to these rounded ones. And we'll talk about where they occur in just a minute. The fungus produces minute, little tiny structures that where these spores are produced. And you notice that the spores are produced in this cavity right here, down inside of fungal tissue. And then there's a long neck right here that the spores come out of at the end. Now, this is an evolved mechanism that certain fungi use so that they're more likely to get picked up by insects. If it's got this long neck, when the insect walks around on the surface of the fungus, it's going to pick up those spores on its body. And this is exactly what occurs with Oak Wilt. I'll show you where that happens in just a minute. Okay, and here it is, right here. We've got something here, on bullet number 5 right here. The fungus forms mats of tissue under the bark on certain trees. Now, it's just certain species of trees out here that form the red oak, or the fungal mats. This is the fungus right here. This gray area is a mat of tissue. It's got a pressure cushion right in the middle of it that pushes the bark off the surface of the tree so that you've got a cavity underneath the bark. This fungal mat has a very sweet smell. And that's not an accident. It has a sweet smell so that it will attract insects in. The insects will feed and breed on the surface of the bark, or on the surface of the mat underneath the bark. And then as the eggs hatch and the insects do their little thing, I'm not an entomologist. So if we have an entomologist, I apologize for butchering this. But as they go through their life stages and they become adults, they emerge from the fungal mat, and then they spread the fungus onto other trees. So this is a very important structure. We know a lot about the fungus. We know how it's classified. It is a very, very good parasite. It can derive nutrition from a living host. And this is not true of most fungi. There are well over now 1 million documented different species and genera of fungi in the world. There are about 70,000 of them are plant pathogens that can actually infect and derive their nutrition from a living host. Some of them are human pathogens. Athlete's foot, for example, is a fungus that can derive nutrition from us. So it does have what we call saprophytic phase, a phase in which it can live on dead, non-living tissue, and that is the fungal mat right there. But it only lasts for about 2 weeks. This fungus is a parasite. It's a good parasite. But once the host dies, the fungus has to get out of that tree and get into another tree very quickly, or it's going to die. It's heat sensitive, believe it or not. It does not like the heat. This is why in all the textbooks that were written in forest pathology up until the mid-1970s, they said that oak wilt will never be a problem in the South because the heat just will eliminate it. There's no way it's going to survive in the southern United States. Well, we certainly proved that one wrong, but that was one of the many reasons why that oak decline got into the myth because people, when they first started really trying to study it in the early 60s, they just eliminated any thought that it could be oak wilt. And therefore they became so focused on other things that they wouldn't allow themselves to say that, gee, maybe there's a way for the fungus to get around the heat during the summertime. And the main way is in the root systems of the trees, down inside the soil, where the temperatures aren't nearly as hot. So therefore, the fungus just kind of hunkers down during the summer, and then the following fall, it'll get picked up again and start moving through the roots again. Now, notice that it doesn't survive in the soil. This fungus cannot survive in the soil. As I said, it's a very, very good parasite, but it can't live in the soil as a saprophyte, which many fungi do. Now, I know I'm moving really fast here. But by all means, stop me if I'm not making something clear. All right, let's talk about species susceptibility. We've already mentioned this, so I can go through it briefly. There are 50 plus oak species. This is probably closer to 72 or so. We can break them down into two major groups, the red oaks and the white oaks. And the red oaks are extremely susceptible. The white oaks have different degrees of resistance. So if we take a post oak, it is very, very resistant to oak wilt. Now that doesn't mean you can't find it. You can find it occasionally out here, but usually it doesn't do any damage to a post oak. It might take a limb out or two, but not to the extent that you would even pay much attention to it. And then some people put live oaks in the white oak group, and they have a fairly low resistance to oak wilt. And then we've got all degrees in between. But Spanish oak, blackjack oak, water oak, those trees never survive when they get infected with oak wilt. Generally, they will be dead within 6 weeks after showing the initial symptoms. Whereas with live oak, which has a low degree of resistance, but not completely susceptible like the red oaks are, you'll see live oaks that will linger on ad infinitum out here. And we're going to talk more about that in just a moment as well. And here it is broken down with just some more different species in here. The live oaks are kind of variable in between the red oaks and the white oaks, even though most authorities put them in with the white oaks. There are some authorities that will say, nah, actually they're in a group all by themselves. But we're not here to talk about the taxonomy of the oaks today. Let's go with it. Tree structure has a lot to do with this business of what's susceptible and what's resistant. If you look at the vascular anatomy, in other words, the tissues in the tree that carry the water from the soil up to the leaves in that process that we call transpiration, we will find that the sizes of these pores, and here they are right here, we call it the xylem where the water is carried. The sizes of the pores can be very, very tiny, as they are in white oaks, or they can be great big, as they are in red oaks. So we know that that's probably one thing that imparts the resistance in the white oak group, because the fungus just can't get around inside the tree, inside these vessels right here as well in the white oak as they can in the red oak. There are other factors that probably are also responsibility for this difference in susceptibility. Bur oaks, it's funny you mentioned bur oaks, because that is one of the oddballs. It's a white oak, but it's more like live oak in that it doesn't have a lot of resistance. It has some, but not a lot. And this is just to show it again. This is a ring porous type of oak wood right here. With the great big vessels. And then you can see these are live oak vessels right here. These are very different. You will notice that live oak produces these vessels all year long, all summer long, right here. And even on into the fall and sometimes in the winter. Whereas with this tree right here, by the time the middle of the summer comes along, it quits producing those great big vessels. So this is another reason why we make certain recommendations that we do about oak wilt that I'll be discussing later on. Let's talk about some other attributes of oak trees. Oak trees, if we have two oak trees growing beside one another, their roots will graft together. And over time, that graft will form a functional connection. so that the two trees will actually share water and inorganic nutrients back and forth. Whichever one is pulling the hardest on a particular day, it's going to get more water than the other tree gets. And you see a lot of popular authors that are writing about this now, talking about how trees are communal organisms that all are living in harmony and are sharing the resources of the forest and that sort of thing. And I'm going to tell you right now, I think it's just the opposite. These are highly competitive creatures that are pulling on each other to try to draw the water away from the other one. I know it's just how you look at the world, I guess. It's just something sad about my outlook. But nonetheless, if one of these trees becomes diseased with a vascular parasite that's living in those water conducting vessels, the other one is going to go, aha, so here's one that's diseased. This one's going to go, I'm pulling stronger. So I'm going to pull the water away from my weaker brethren right here. But it's also going to suck those spores right up and kill it too. That's one way the oak wilt fungus gets around, is by being drawn from one tree to the next through their connected roots. Now, the live oak, and this is one of the reasons why live oak is particularly vulnerable, is that it reproduces clonally through root sprouts. And I'm sure everybody in here that has a live oak has noticed, look at these little sprouts coming up. A lot of times it's in your St. Augustine lawn or something, and try to figure out a way to get rid of them. Or you just walk around in the woods out there and you will see sprouts coming up all over the place. That is a growth habit of live oak that results in genetically identical individuals like this mott of oaks right here. And you can see they're all very even aged. And the ones in the middle are a little taller, which is what you'd expect because they're competing harder for life. But if we came and put the oak wilt fungus into the trunk of one of these on the edge, within a couple of years, it would be halfway across here because this is a highly interconnected root system right here. As these trees sprout, they maintain that root system, that the old mother tree root system on which they're growing. And as a result, we have an additional mechanism here in Texas with the live oak that allows for the fungus to grow very, very quickly through the rangelands, where we see these huge, great big expanding oak wilt centers out there. Now that's different. They don't have that in West Virginia or Michigan or Wisconsin or Ohio or anywhere else where oak wilt occurs. We are the only state that has oak wilt in native live oak populations where we have root sprouting like this. This is another reason why Texas has so many losses. It's the live oak where we incur most of the losses, even though red oaks do get it, but it's the live oaks where we get all the losses, and it's in part because of the root connections. Thank you. Yes, sir.
You have a red oak and a live oak within 50, 60 feet, or their roots going to intervene?
Yes. Now, well, I'm assuming you're talking about a 10, 12-inch tree. Certainly when they're little tiny seedlings, they won't, but they will eventually. 40-inch caliber. Yeah, they will eventually mingle. Yes, and they will, and we do get interspecies root grafting between reds and whites. Yes. Any other questions?
Follow-up question.
Okay.
You have a red oak infected in your subdivision. It's obvious that you know it's red oak, and it's an acre away, 600 to 700 feet away. Obviously, the roots it's not going to spread through the roots, but what can be done to prevent that spreading onto your plant?
I'm going to spend a whole lot of time on that in just a few minutes.
Okay.
Can we go ahead and let's just go ahead and wait till I get the slides up here. It's a good question. Don't get me wrong. It's a great question, but I'll just be able to illustrate it better. This is what root grafts look like, functional root grafts right here. We do see them. Live oaks will, in addition to what we call the common root system of the live oak, where they are genetically identical clonal trees that are growing off the same root system. In addition to that, two planted live oaks will eventually, if they're growing beside each other, graft together. So, so that in old neighborhoods in Dallas where we study the epidemiology of the disease, it spreads the same way it does in town where we've got planted trees as it does out on the rangelands where we've got the common root systems because the root systems all become connected. This happens at A&M. We have 2 Oak Wilt centers on campus. Yes.
When this occurs, which tree normally becomes the dominant?
When they graft together?
Yeah.
Well, I can't say that. That's going to have a lot to do with genetics. It's going to have a lot to do with microsite factors, soil types, that sort of thing. That's a tough question. I don't have.
Red oak versus white oak.
Oh, you mean between the interspecies root graft? That's a tough question. I'm not sure. Yeah, I don't know. It's a very good question, and you know, you give me, I don't know, 750 grand in 2 years, and I can figure it out for you. but it's
Not worth that to me.
I don't know. I don't know anybody that's ever looked at that before. I can't think of anybody that looks at it. It's an interesting
Could be a
idea.
good project. for
I'm
something.
going to be thinking about the rest of the talk now. So I'm so distracted from here on out. It's because I'm thinking, how would you study that? Okay, and you can see these 3 trees. It gets to the point where you can't even tell where one tree starts and one tree stops with live oaks. With all the grafting that goes on when they're planted close together. And these probably might have even been root sprouts from the same root system at one time too. So that what we're looking at there is some common roots in there as well. But vascular parasites love this kind of situation. Dutch elm disease. That's why it was so devastating in the Midwestern United States, where they planted those millions and millions of elm trees in the Great Plains, going from Ohio out into Indiana and Illinois in that direction. And Dutch elm disease just ate those communities up because they were all grafted together at some point up and down those streets of those communities. Okay, so let's move on. We've talked about the fungus a little bit. We've talked about the fungus and the host. And let's talk about temperature and moisture. Now, this is where people go, aha, I knew it. Drought makes it worse. And you know, people will always, when I got down here in 81, people said, well, it really got bad because of the drought of the 50s. That's what happened. And indeed, it did seem to coincide in the 60s. It did seem to get worse, but actually what happened in the 60s was a huge expansion of people into the hill country. The ranchette revolution came up. And as a result of that, we're going to see why that's the case in just a second. But it had nothing to do with the drought per se. Temperature and moisture does influence the situation. Spores for insect spread form in cool, moist conditions. You remember those fungal mats? If we have a very, very dry spring, then and it turns warm very quickly, we get very few fungal mat formation. And we've gotten to the point now where we've noticed you just have less oak wilt in that particular year. It doesn't go away, you just don't have as many new oak wilt centers showing up. Because the trees that form the fungal mats like to have an extended period of cool, moist conditions. Heat suppresses growth and survival of the pathogen. So here's another influence. So by the time the end of May, June comes along, things really start shutting down with oak wilt. You get into July and you don't see a lot of new spread from one tree to the next. Like I say, the fungus just kind of goes quiescent in the root systems. It doesn't move along quite as quickly as it does because it needs to work its way up into the tree. If heat will suppress that kind of growth. So during the summer, as a matter of fact, the pathogen gets eliminated from the limbs and branches of trees. There's been good research to show that that goes on in the southern range over in South Carolina and North Carolina, that area as well. And also the heat suppresses the vectors. As soon as it gets hot, the insects that carry the fungus, their populations just plummet. So here's the fungal mat. Don't need to talk about that. just to show you, this is what you see on the outside. You see a split in the bark where the fungus has pushed the bark away from the surface. You can have many of them on a tree. I've counted as many as 50 fungal mats on a tree. Usually they form on material down to about 2 to 3 inches in diameter. Anything smaller than that, you don't get fungal mats on it. And as I said, they produce a very sweet odor. I think they smell like rotting melons. We get all kinds of things. Students always go to fermented things first. Oh, it smells like beer, smells like wine, and that is the truth. Grad students, you always ask them, what do you think? It smells kind of like beer, doctor. Even growing in the laboratory, it produces a smell. So we can pick the lid off a Petri plate with it and smell it right there. It's one way to identify you have the right culture. Here they are. Now here, these are old ones, and they're starting to get overrun by another fungus. This is the name of this fungus is Trypathesium, but you can see there's a bunch of them. These guys, there's one up there. So they're going to keep forming on out on these limbs and branches and all up and down the trunk. This is what the beetle looks like. To get a size of the size, because they are not this big. There's the head of a pin right there. So these are really tiny little beetles. They are called knitted beetles. That's the common name for them. Another common name is picnic beetles. These are beetles that are known vectors of fungi in lots of plant pathogen relationships. For example, where I come from in the Ohio Valley, knitted or picnic beetles are a big problem in tomato production because they carry diseases around. They get on tomato plants. They carry diseases around that will destroy corn out there. They're a well-known bunch of plant pathogens. So it's no surprise that knitted beetles, which are attracted to fermenting type odors, smells, real sweet smells, like a wounded tomato or a wounded corn cob. They get attracted to that. They have these fungi on their bodies. They introduce the fungi into the plant material, and then the fungi begin to cause disease. We got 6 different species of them. Let's see, what's left? Oh, so we have to put another element on here, the knitted beetle between Brezziella and Quercus, but however, the temperature and moisture also, as I've already said, influence the activities of the knitted beetles as well. These are opportunistic beetles. This separates this type of disease from one with Dutch elm disease. Every tree that dies of Dutch elm disease becomes a huge breeding gallery for the elm bark beetle, where the population of the beetles build up in these trees. That's why we are very, very adamant about Dutch elm disease. You need to get the wood away and destroy it as soon as the tree becomes diseased, because all you're doing is providing breeding habit for the beetles. That does not occur with knitted beetles. They would just as soon go to a rotting banana peel as they would a fungal mat. They will go to all kinds of things out there. Let's see, I've already said all that. Okay. And this is just another picture of them. Don't talk about that. This is the relationship we have, that you've got the fungal mat, the knitted beetle visits the fungal mat. It will stay on that mat for maybe a week or so, laying eggs. The eggs will hatch. And this is a pretty quick operation. Within a couple of weeks, the adults start coming out, and those adults emerge, and then they get attracted to fresh wounds on oak trees. So here's a new element that I've now brought into it. Wounds on oak trees are how this beetle manages to get that fungus out of a dead tree into a new healthy tree, a wound. So, and this goes back to the fact that as populations of people kept coming out to the hill country, as I say, breaking up the ranches into ranchettes and cutting trees and cutting branches and that sort of thing, that will add to the epidemic, so that we get more wounding, we get more infections going on. Okay, so I'm going to give us a break, okay? Now we got started kind of late, so we are going to, you've got till 10 after to stretch your legs, do whatever you want, but let's get back in our seats at 10 after, okay? So we're gonna start talking about management here in just a second. If you didn't get one of these, wonderful nuggets coming out of my mouth and I miss some. You make a lot of money. Yeah, it'd be very challenging. The type of resistance doesn't lend itself to that very well. It's not like wheat or corn or something like that. Okay, so we're going to go through what we call the disease cycle of the Oak Wilt fungus, and this is going to answer some of the questions that I was getting up here and clarify some of the things that I rolled through very quickly. And once we do this, then we go into control. And you're going to see why. If you go through the disease cycle the way I'm going to do it, you will start seeing, oh, that's why they do X, Y, and Z to control Oak Wilt, and you'll be able to start figuring it out yourself. You won't need me anymore. So, let's see. I'm retired. Okay. So in Texas, if we were doing this in Wisconsin right now, we would just have the red oak phase. There would be no live oak phase to it. And that's because they don't have live oaks in Wisconsin. And this live oak is such an outlier that we've taken the traditional Oak Wilt disease cycle and added on to it with a different phase. So we're going to start with a healthy red oak. Now this is important. We're just talking about red oaks right now. Okay? Red oaks. Not live oak, not white oaks, but the red oaks. This would be blackjack oak out here, Texas red oak, the very common red oak. I saw some up on the side of the hill. It's coming up here with that earlier today. They're all over the place, but we're just talking about the red oak. So we have a red oak, and we have a contaminated unidulate. So the beetles picked up the fungus from somewhere. And this is what we call overland spread. And we've got a wound on this red oak. Now, let me say something else. This is another key factor in this whole equation. And that is the wound is only susceptible for about 3 days. And after 3 days or so, it can't get infected anymore. And there's a number of reasons for this. But it's sort of like a biological control. It has to be a fresh wound. This is why when we recommend if you're going to do wound management, you need to do it right away. Doesn't do any good to come out a week later and then take care of the wound. You have to take care of the wound just about as soon as it occurs. Okay, now let's not forget about the root connections. We're going to leave them behind for just a minute. So let's just leave that alone. And we're going to go over here. Now, if this infection occurs very early in the summer, then the red oak's going to be dead by the end of the summer. They rarely survive out of the first summer that they get infected. So when you're driving around out here and you're in an area where there's a lot of oak wilt, you look across the hillsides in August, you'll see these bright red trees on a green background tucked in amongst the live oaks and the ash juniper on the hillsides. You can pick them out there. However, you have some that are infected later in the summer. And those trees are not going to be totally dead by the end of the summer. Those are the trees that are going to have the fungal mats on them. Now remember, I'm just dealing with red oaks, and now I'm narrowing it down to only a certain proportion of the red oaks. Okay, let's keep going. So the ones that die in the early summer, they're dead. And the ones that are infected later in the summer, they're dying in the fall, but they aren't completely dead. I never know what kind of terminology to use here for all the years I've been talking about it. Nothing's partly dead. except with trees. And trees, there's still a little bit of life left in these red oaks. And so the following spring, the mats form underneath the bark. So trees that, we're in February. Yeah, so if we are going to, it's warming up out there, and we're going to start seeing mat formation out here. We are just getting into mat season in the hill country. So this is going to happen right now, but these are from trees that were infected last summer of 2021. And they made it through the fall and winter, and they just have a little tiny bit of life left in them. So the fungus is still in the tree. If the tree is dead, the fungus can't survive. It's got that parasitic habit. It has to have a living host. So the nididulid beetles are attracted to the mats, and bingo, we've completed our red oak phase. Now there's two ways for the fungus to get into a live oak. One through a root connection from the red oak, or the nididulid beetle could go to a live oak as well. Remember, it's an opportunist. If there's a wound on a live oak, it's going to go to a live oak wound. It'll go to a hackberry wound as well. But the hackberry wound, nothing's going to happen. There's not going to be any consequences because hackberries are immune to oak wilt. It's about the only thing they're immune to, but they won't get oak wilt. So now we have our fungus getting into a diseased live oak. And bingo, because of these massive root connections, remember the common root systems that these trees make? Then we get what we call local spread, rapid spreading live oak mortality, tree after tree, huge acreages of trees being killed. But the peculiar thing is, fungal mats don't ever form on live oaks, and we don't know why. This is it's something nobody's ever gotten around to studying, but you do not get fungal mats, so you don't get beetle spread out of the live oak. There are no known beetles, and there's some people up in Wisconsin say, well, there's this oak bark beetle that might spread it a little bit. We've looked into it. It ain't happening in Texas. We've looked at it enough now. We're confident. It's the nididulid beetle. So no mats, no nididulid beetle spread. So it's kind of a dead end in live oak. So if the stand of oaks come up to I-35 or Canyon Lake or I-10, it won't spread across because there's no beetles to spread it. It stops right there. Yes.
How far is the range for the nididulid beetles?
About a mile. But you see how little they are. Yeah, I'm proud that was at West Virginia University, one of my alma maters. Studies they did at WVU, and they did something that you could never do now. They created thousands and thousands of radioactive nididulid beetles and set them loose. This is a true story. You could do anything you wanted back in the 50s. Really. And they set these things loose, and then they did thorough searches for miles and miles and miles around. And they could pick up a radioactive beetle occasionally about a mile away, but any further, they never got in. That's the only study that's ever been done on that. So. Yes, sir.
I understand what oak wilt looks like, but what is it doing to the tree to actually kill it?
Okay, so again, it gets in the water conducting vessels. This is plant pathogens are like human pathogens. I mean, we've got pathogens that infect nervous system, pathogens that infect stomachs, pathogens that infect. Same thing with trees. You have pathogens on the foliage, you have pathogens in the roots, on the surface of the roots, and you also have pathogens like the oak wilt fungus that lives in the vascular system, down inside that outer 2 to 3 inches that carries the water for the tree, right underneath the bark, and it plugs it up. To simply put it very simply, it just plugs it up. It causes a shutdown of transpiration. The tree can no longer move water, and that's a definite. Okay. Let's see. Okay, so let's talk about control. How we doing? Yeah, let me just get out of here. Okay, always starts with diagnosis. Don't just name.
I did miss how the beetles, why they were not alive in the live oaks. So
No,
they
it's
could-
not that they're not alive. Okay, this is a great question. Because this gives people, this seems to be, and I'm gonna single out you master gardeners in here. Y'all seem to get hung up on this. I'm glad you asked, because I have talked to master gardeners a year later and go, I didn't do a very good job on that. So let's listen to this. I don't care if this is all we talk about the rest of the day. You can read the brochure and figure out how to control it. You gotta get this straight in your mind. The Nidodulic beetles up here, they'll get on a fungal mat. Now the fungal mats are only on red oaks, right? We got that. The Nidodulic beetle, after that, it's going to be attracted to sweet smelling things. And anybody that's ever cut a limb off of a live oak or a red oak, you can really smell it, right? It has actually a very pleasant smell. Nidodulids like it too, and they are going to be attracted to that. So the beetle will visit these wounds on different oak species, and that's how it gets the fungus down into that vascular system again. This fungus, if the beetle just goes to the bark of the tree and doesn't get on a wound, it's never going to be able to inoculate that tree with the fungus. The fungus has to have a fresh wound. We got that? Y'all with me on that? Okay, so then the fungus starts growing through the vascular system of the tree. When it does so with a red oak, it is possible, and it's only about 1 out of 5 of those red oaks that become diseased in the hill country will have fungal mats on the following year. About 1 out of 5. However, none of the live oaks have fungal mats on them. They get infected, they die, but the fungus is not able to produce that mat of tissue underneath the bark. So there's no place for the beetles to ever pick it up. So the only spread we have from one tree to the next in the live oak is through the root connection. With me? Now, don't humor me on this, all right? I get this from my students all the time, because they're just, and I shut up. And they look me right now and go, and I know what it looks like. Okay? Are you sure you've got it now?
Yeah, they didn't make the place for the little bugs. And
Perfect. They don't make the place for the little bugs to get the fungus. That's exactly right. Yes.
So a wound on the white oak does not, the beetle does not infect.
Yes,
because it's
it
not
does.
a gut.
It does. Sure, the beetles can go to the red oak, or as I've got right here, they can go to a live oak and make it diseased as well. But it always has to be a wound. There always has to be a wound. The Nidodulic beetles, another name for them that they call them are sap beetles, because they like moisture coming off a plant. Part of the reason is that all that moisture, bacteria and yeast growing it immediately, and the beetles like to eat that substance, that kind of fermenting stuff that's going on there. Yes, sir.
A while ago, I thought I understood you saying that the life of the beetle is diminished in summertime.
Yeah, well, they do. There's an entomologist company they call it epidemic. They don't like the heat either. And they get down underneath the dust or the leaves and that sort of thing, and they wait it out, and then they come out. The ones that survive that come out again in the fall.
So are the municipalities restrictions on trees in the winter time?
Right. Right. And I understand Robert gave a talk, and he said the best time to prune is, what were those dates again?
October to February.
October to February. I like to put it a different way. The way I put it is the day you least want to go out there and prune on your tree is the day you should be out there. The hottest day and the coldest day. Yeah, that's the way I put it. Texas Forest Service is a little more mechanistically inclined. They want an equation, which everybody usually wants. Just tells you the exact dates. Well, this is biology. The exact dates are not real hard. It can vary with the environment.
But you can prune them in April as long as you spray them right. Is that right?
Yes, you can, as long as you spray them right away. Yes. I mean, we recognize sometimes you have to prune a tree. You don't have any choice. It has to be pruned. And we shouldn't blame this all on us pruning either. We were really concerned about all the broken limbs and branches from last February. And it probably did cause a bunch of Oak Wilt centers. Yes.
So you kind of segued into my question. When you say a wound, I think a lot of people assume that's a man-made,
Yeah.
So, but it can be like from a freeze or from a wind.
Absolutely.
How about like the deer?
Absolutely. Anything that breaks that bark and exposes the sapwood down underneath the bark. Anything that breaks through there, a knitted julep beetle will be attracted to it. Now, we might as well get a little philosophical here. Somebody asked earlier, I forget how they posed it. It might have been during the break. But all the trees are never going to die, all right? And they said like in Dutch elm disease or something, and all the elms didn't die. Now, all the chestnuts died, but even, and we say that, but there are still huge stands of little baby chestnut trees coming up off the root systems in West Virginia and Pennsylvania. Because there's a thing called juvenile resistance. So the trees don't become susceptible until they come to a bearing stage for nuts, and then they become susceptible and they die back. It's rare that you lose all the trees. Oak wilt is actually, it's got a whole lot of steps in there that slow it down. You have to have the wounds, for example. No wound, no oak wilt, unless you're connected to another disease tree. You have to have the fungal merits. Only 1 out of 5 Spanish oaks out here, and that's probably in a good year. In a bad year, it's probably a lot less. You have to have knitted julep beetles around. They have to be contaminated. I mean, it just goes on and on. So that this oak wilt is taught as a very inefficient pathogen. It doesn't get around as well as its cousin, the Dutch elm disease fungus does. We got a brand new one in East Texas called laurel wilt. High in my mind, we're working on it a whole lot right now. It's transmitted very easily compared to oak wilt. If oak wilt had an efficient vector system, then we'd see a lot more mortality than we do now. Okay, just trying to cheer you up. Okay. So how do we diagnose oak wilt? Well, I've got this 5-step process. I'm just going to go through it real quickly. As a matter of fact, I'm just going to go through them one at a time. Number one, the pattern out there. When you see a center of diseased trees like this, and the trees are dying on the outer perimeter, moving out like that, you're pretty sure it's oak wilt. There are very few things other than herbicide damage, and there are some pretty serious herbicides that people get their hands on that will mimic oak wilt when they apply it out in the rangeland as it spreads through groundwater. But that's about the only thing. Old fire damage can sometimes fool us too. But if you have a lot of red oaks, the pattern is going to be different because now you're bringing an insect vector into it, and it isn't as clean as this is. You've just got spread that the beetles are randomly moving through the stand of trees, and they'll skip trees and that sort of thing. So you have to keep in mind, if you've got fungal mats in the stand, like down here near Bandera, it's not going to give you this nice, clean pattern. And I already mentioned, we did a lot of epidemiology work up in Dallas. We found that we could actually plot out in neighborhoods depending on the proportion of live oaks, how rapidly it was going to spread through the connected root systems of the live oaks. And it looked about the same as it does out on rangeland. Okay, the pattern in individual trees, not the population, but individual trees. Red oaks have 0% survival and they're dead in a matter of weeks. Whereas live oaks have a 15 to 20% survival and the rate of death is kind of variable. So natural resource managers out here, mostly TFS people, soil conservation service people, that sort of thing. They get to recognize this when they go into a stand of trees and they look at how fast the trees are dying. That gives them a clue. You know, this is probably Oak Wilt or it's not Oak Wilt because whether or not it fits this pattern right here between the two species. The foliage is the way to identify it. This is what it looks like. You can see the necrosis right here on these leaves. These are old leaves, probably from months from when the tree was originally infected. You've got the pictures in that brochure right here. Here's a classic picture that's out of focus. We sometimes get this, what we call vein banding on the leaves. Red oaks don't do that though. Red oaks just kind of turn a bronze color and you get kind of a brown scorching. You don't get these distinct patterns like you do on the live oaks. You see a fungal mat, you know you've got Oak Wilt because you're looking at the fungus. Yeah, this is the one thing that you can look at and say, yeah, that's Oak Wilt. Now the trick is recognizing a fungal mat. I get this all the time. Arborists will send me a picture. Oh, you said I'd never see fungal mats, and it's a picture of some fungus or just a stained area on the wood, something of that nature, or it might be hypoxylin. Some people will mistake hypoxylin. Who was it? Somebody said that they had a hypoxylin problem in their tree. Yes, sir. That's a canker-causing fungus, and some people will even confuse hypoxylin with fungal mats just because they hear, "Why? I remember him saying something about the bark, and so that must be it." These are really distinctive, folks. And when they're fresh, and they only stay fresh for a couple of weeks, I mean, it is a fungus out there, and you just go ahead and smell it. I mean, and if it's got a sweet smell, then you have come right up face to face with the Oak Wilt fungus. And it does happen occasionally. If you're walking around in a stand of red oaks where there's a lot of Oak Wilt, you can be 10, 15 feet away and you know you can smell a tree somewhere. I mean, that's how heavy the smell is. Yes.
If you smell it, can you like spray it with vinegar? Will that help the pH?
You could spray it with vinegar. You could take a can of paint and spray on it. You could scrape it off and put it in a bottle, and you could do something like that. It's just remember that these things are really rare. I know you give me this look like, well, there's millions of dead trees out there, but that's one of the things about epidemiology, and we're not going to get into epidemiology today. But with the kind of this disease falls into a certain category of diseases, that it requires only just a little bit of the inoculum out there to keep the epidemic rolling along. You want to hang around? Well, we got another speaker, so. But it's just a peculiar type of epidemiology. It doesn't take much to keep this going. Again, it's a very inefficient system having to rely on these fungal mats.
Excuse me,
Yes.
When does the smell start? Is it already diseased? Is it already way past the time to do anything?
No, you could do something about it if you smell it, then, but you can be sure that there's probably already been beetles coming and going off of it.
So it doesn't start like it doesn't take 2 or 3 days before you start to smell it.
Right. So
Sorry.
So no, these are great questions. There's a huge experiment by the U.S. Forest Service, and they pitted Pennsylvania against West Virginia back in the 50s. Pennsylvania took one approach to control Oak Wilt. West Virginia took the other approach to control Oak Wilt. West Virginia did what was called deep girdling a tree. If the tree had Oak Wilt, they would deep girdle it and cause it to dry out immediately. Pennsylvania, and if they did have a tree with fungal mats on it, they would cut it down there on its side and spray diesel on it. As a matter of fact, near the end of it, I got to participate in that before they did away with the whole thing. Pennsylvania just cut the trees down, took them away and destroyed them. That's it in a nutshell. They collected the data for about 5 years. They did all the measurements of new disease centers, and they looked at the whole thing and said, none of it worked. And then they figured out why it didn't work. But the one thing that they did say was, get rid of the mat, one way or another. If you have a diseased Spanish or red oak out there, cut it down and destroy it. Pennsylvania was right that would work. It's just that Pennsylvania didn't take the root grafting into account. So they had trees come up beside. So you're going along the right lines. It's just finding these things. It is extremely difficult. They're stuck way out in it's what we used to say in West Virginia, all the hollers out there are full of red oaks. It's hard to get to them. And then finally, you can utilize the Texas Plant Disease Diagnostic Laboratory by taking sapwood like this or branches from diseased trees, and we will plate it out in the diagnostic lab. I'm starting to lose my battery. Plate it out in the diagnostic lab. There's the wood chips and there's the fungus growing out, that little gray matter right there, growing out of the wood chip right there. This is important. Texas A&M does have a laboratory that they're in the business of diagnosing plant diseases for you. They do about 3,000 samples are sent in a year, costs $35 a pop, but they will tell you what's wrong with your plant and what you can do about it. And they also do a lot of Oak Wilt diagnostics as well for people. Arborists use them a lot because if they're going to tell a client, you've got Oak Wilt, people say, prove it. So they collect samples, send it into the clinic. The clinic says yes. They can take the paperwork back to the client and say, see, it is Oak Wilt before you spend 10 grand treating your trees. I'm not going to go into what they do in the laboratory. There are instructions on how to properly bag up a sample. Notice we use an ice chest because it has to be kept cool. Remember, heat is lethal to this fungus. It doesn't like high temperatures. And so therefore, you have to take a lot of precautions to make sure it's going to be kept cool as it goes into the clinic. They probably do about 120 of these a year or so. It's laborious for the person collecting it, that sort of thing, but it is effective. Okay. Let's talk about 2 means of prevention: avoid wounding in the spring and use wound pads. Well, we've already talked about this. Don't prune between February 1 and June 1. And if the tree does get wounded by some other agent, then spray a wound paint on it immediately. It's very simple. You can use commercially available wound paints, or you can use latex spray paint. Paint the same color as the bark. If you want to, it doesn't matter. You're just putting a barrier between that sapwood right there and the Nidodulid beetle so that it isn't attracted to it and it won't spread the fungus onto the wound. Okay, cautious movement of firewood. Here's a squirrel that helped us out one day. You can see we actually painted that wound right there, and the next day we came out, and for some reason the thing just loved that place to lay right there. It's just like it was waiting to get this picture taken. Okay, cautious movement of firewood. If somebody cuts up one of these red oaks and sells it for firewood immediately, let's say in September, they cut the tree down and buck it up and sell it to somebody that's going to take it back down to Houston, the fungal mats could form on the firewood, wherever that firewood is taken. This is how it got to Lubbock. This is how it got to Amarillo. This is how it got to Midland, Odessa. Somebody dragged firewood out there that had fungal mats form on them, and they didn't know it, and they got Oak Wilt started in their neighborhoods.
And this is true only with the red oak.
Did everybody hear that? If I had a prize, I would give it to you. That's right. This only happens with the red oak. Thank you.
What
Yeah.
about with mulch? They will come out probably with.
Mulch is okay. Mulch is okay. This is a poor saprophyte. Once that wood gets all mulched up, there are probably 40 or 50 species of fungi which grow over it within a matter of hours. I mean, these fungi are fast. They grow very quickly. And the Oak Wilt fungus, remember, it's a good parasite, but it's a terrible sacrifice. Mulching is a great thing to do, and you can use the mulch, yes. We say cover infected red oak logs with clear plastic, like this homeowner. I was so happy to see that. Had to jump out of the truck and go and take a picture. Cover it with clear plastic if it's going to be left all summer long on site. But we just recommend burn up your firewood by February and get rid of it. It's the best thing to do. Don't buy more than you need. Okay, what do we do about these root connections? We get out big, heavy equipment and dig trenches. They should go at least 4 feet deep. And we also like to rogue, and here's a couple different kinds of equipment being used. We can use belt trenchers, backhoes, ripper bars, rock saws. There's about 4 or 5 of these operating in the hill country, these rock saws for oak wilt control. Usually at any given time, 3 of them are working and the other 2 are in the shop. these things take a beating. It's hard to keep them going, but they're very effective. They dig a very narrow trench. Doesn't matter how wide the trench is, as long as you cut those roots. You don't have to put anything down in there as far as barriers go. You can put the soil right back into the trench. It's okay. There's a lot of trenching that goes on by the Texas Forest Service. The Texas Forest Service has a cost share program that if your land falls into certain criteria, then they can go ahead and supplement your efforts with some federal dollars through a federal pest control program that we get from the U.S. Forest Service. Yes, sir.
How far from the living tree do you have to put this trench and to ensure that the bad infected tree doesn't cross?
Let me put it another way. I got a slide that addresses that exact thing. I like to see the trees on the inside of the trench pushed up. You can see how the roots pop out of the ground like this. It creates hundreds and hundreds of wounds that starts to encourage that root system to die back. And that's what we want, is to try to disrupt the root system as much as possible. Now, where do we put the trenches to address your question? So you have some targets to look for. The first target is the outermost symptomatic tree. These are the ones with symptoms on them. Now, this is in live oak right here. So you don't want to dig your trench right here because these trees may have what we call latent infections. In other words, the tree is infected, but it takes like 20 to 30 days for the symptoms to really get obvious on the tree. And if you're in that latent period, if you dig the trench here, you've missed it. And I can tell you, back in the 1980s, we missed it a lot. It took a lot of research to finally figure this out. So therefore, we now recommend going out 100 feet beyond the symptomatic tree and dig our primary trench. Now, if you want to play around and dig trenches all around in there, you can, because you might even save a tree or 2. But nonetheless, that primary trench has to go 100 feet out from the outermost symptomatic tree, 4 feet deep. Okay, intravascular injection with fungicides. Let me just show a picture of it so you can see what we're talking about here, and then I'm going to back up. I probably ought to show this first. This is what a typical vascular injection operation looks like. Now, there are other ways to do it, and I'm going to show you in just a minute. But what we have here are 2 containers, modified garden sprayers, hooked up by this black tube going into the clear tubing, which then is connected by a series of ports, which are inserted into the tree through holes that are drilled down into the sapwood. And then you just put the name of the product is called Alamo. You mix it with water, you put it in there, and you put a little bit of pressure under it, and then the tree will take the fungicide out. It's called intravascular injection. You're going into the vascular system of the tree with the fungicide. Now, there's lots of different kinds of equipment to use, but the one I'm talking about here is a certain technique that we call the macro system. And you can buy this equipment. I know over south of Fredericksburg, they sell it. There are some places that sell it. Hanky Fence Supply out there sells it. And you can get it on the internet as well. Back up just a little bit. There are a lot of discussions going on with how to inject and certain things that we like people to do. We like people to get below the, you notice how the soil was excavated so that you could get on those root systems? That's called a root flare injection. The bark is thinner below the soil line. It's easier to make the holes. It increases the number of potential injection sites. If you're going to inject the tree more than once, and usually we recommend 2 injections, and also you get superior distribution of the fungicide. Okay, and that's already talked about that. So expose the root flare and inject it like that.
Okay, question.
Yes,
That takes care of the tree, the upper part of the tree.
yes.
The disease though is still in the root system.
Okay, the fungus is
Yes.
still in the root system.
How do
So what's your point?
How do you deal with it?
You dig a trench.
Well, it's still in the root system is what I'm saying on that tree right there.
Well, yeah, but this tree's gonna be protected. If you get this, if you do what we call a protective, a preventive injection. If you inject a tree just before the fungus gets up to the tree that you want to treat, let's say you're watching it move down the street and it hits your neighbor's yard, then it's time to inject your trees. So when it moves through, the tree is protected and it's going to survive. It's still going to get oak wilt. It's just that the fungus is going to keep moving through the root system and your tree is going to survive because the fungus can't grow up into it and plug up all the vascular system.
So it's like a COVID.
There are so many bacteria, and I don't even point them out. I just let all you guys. Yeah, I don't need to be bringing up more misery, so I just go ahead. I stick with the tree disease.
We had a question.
I am giving a talk next week in Arlington, and I'm going to do exactly that, though. I'm going to compare code to a different tree disease.
We had a question online. How much does it cost per tree to do the injection?
About somewhere between 9 and as much as you'll pay per diameter inch. So if you're out on the hill country and you're going to have 500 trees injected, very common, then you'll get away with $8 to $10 per diameter inch. So a 10-inch tree will be $80. If you are in certain neighborhoods in Dallas, it's going to be $400 or $500 a diameter inch. That's the tree. Yes.
Exposed roots,
Not living in Dallas.
if they get damaged, you should treat them like a wound on the tree.
I would, yeah.
Sorry.
Now, you're gonna ask, what about those trenches? We've looked into that and tried to figure out if those roots that are in the trenches that are cut. But if you look at those roots, they are completely covered with dirt. And within just minutes, fungi start growing. And so therefore, there's no such thing as a fresh wound down there. So therefore, we've never considered the roots to be above
ground.
Yeah, yes,
Treated-
that should be treated,
treated
right,
like that.
absolutely, absolutely. Okay, let's see. Oh, there's a new injection technique out there. This is what it looks like. It has little bitty containers like this, and you don't expose the root flares, and you don't have to put as many holes in it. And it works pretty good. Works all right. There are advantages and disadvantages to each of the techniques that we just don't have time to go into all that right now. But I can tell you that if you are enlisting an arborist to inject your tree for oak wilt, you should get somebody who is certified with Oak Wilt certified, that you can go to the Texas Forest Service website and find a list of arborists in your area that have been through all of our trainings. We put on 3 trainings every summer for arborists, and they get a certificate and they get their name on the list. They know what they're doing. And there's one technique works better in some locations, another technique works better on other trees. Yes.
How long does the treatment usually last?
The treatment lasts, okay, now this is where the one time, if you preserve too hard, I'm gonna get irritated with you, all right? So, everybody always wants to know, when do I inject the next time? And there's no good answer for that. You inject the next time when the tree needs it. And that's the only thing I can say about it. This is like disease control with, I'm gonna say code, like leukemia. I mean, if you go in for your first chemo for leukemia, and you say to the doctor, well, when am I getting the next one? After you've completed your first round, they're gonna say, well, when we think you need it, that you have to watch and let the tree tell you that. And in order to learn to talk to a tree, you're gonna have to hear my lecture on that. Really, you have to watch the tree, look for symptoms, see whether or not a lot of times a good preventative treatment never needs another treatment. But if you're gonna insist, I'm just gonna say, have it done twice. Yeah, just have it done twice. Try to space it a year apart. And that way you don't have to worry about it, but you are buying another treatment. And if you've got 20 trees in your front yard, this is very expensive. This starts running up real fast. You've got a lot of trees on your farm. Okay, finally, and we are wrapping it up. Plant resistant immune trees. I am a big proponent of the Texas Forest Service tree selector guide right here, Express Tree Selector. You can use it in custom tree selector. I'm sorry I didn't make a new one for you guys. So the last time I gave this talk I did it for Victoria County. So you put what county you're in, you put what size tree you're in, you click view the best trees, and it'll start giving you trees. And they will tell you if you're in a high-risk county, they will tell you if you're going to plant these oaks and you've got a problem. But it will also give you other immune trees to plant in the place of the oaks that you've lost. Now, there are tons of these resources on the internet. You've probably had somebody come in and give you little booklets with the best 10 trees for Texas, or you've got a poster or something with it on it. That's true, I recognize it. I'm just showing you one resource, and this is the one that I usually use when somebody's bugging me. Well, what kind of tree should I plant? And so I just refer them to this. Never heard anybody come up with that. Okay. And so we can, Oak Wilt control does work. We can manage this disease. As I said, it takes a combination of things. It takes a combination of trenching, a combination of injection, a combination of removal to put together a management plan. And it's not easy, especially in a situation like this where the stand is already infected. And remember, if this is all live oak, it's like dealing with one big tree with lots of different stems on it. And you have to think about it like that and put a combination of things together to look at your bank account and see how much you can afford to pay these people that want to do it. And you can minimize the losses to Oak Wilt. And with that, I'm going to keep going. We got 5 more minutes.
I got.
Yes, sir.
Does oak wilt affect any other tree species other than oaks?
Not under natural conditions.
Like
We can
pecan trees or any of
experimentally get chestnut trees, for example. We'll catch oak wilt, but they're related. Some people have gotten beech trees, but it has to be in the Fagaceae.
But not a pecan tree?
Absolutely not.
Okay.
Absolutely not. It will not affect pecans or hackberries or any, all the stuff, mesquite, bald cypress, everything out here. Yes.
I live here in Fungal County and I want a nice big oak tree. Should I plant one of these oaks or should I look for another species, another variety?
Plant oaks.
Go ahead and plant oaks.
Yeah, oaks are the best adapted trees to come out county. I mean, they're going to, now they're not the fastest growing trees, but they usually grow faster than everybody expects. But they are the best adapted tree. They are the trees that require the least maintenance. The squirrels love them and the deer love them. And it's just, yeah, I never recommend disease control of just don't have the plant.
What about the Texas, the Mexican white oak?
Mexican white oak does get oak wilt, but it carries some resistance, we think. But yeah, Mexican white oak does get it. But if you guys are master gardeners, you've just been trained in it so that you will know what it looks like if it's a problem in the tree in the first place and do something about it. But on the other hand, it's still the best tree for Comal County and all places in the hill country. Yes, just mix it up. Don't plant all red. As a matter of fact, I'd stay away from the red oaks. And it's not because of Oak Wilt. It's because if you put any water whatsoever on your lawn, the red oaks that you buy at Lowe's are not well adapted to our environment and the water that we have to give them to keep them alive. Yes.
If you're pruning in the window of uncertainty, but you're pruning dead wood out of the tree, 1 inch, 2 inch, something like that.
Don't have to paint.
And that,
You can't infect dead tissue. Good question.
So if you have a tree that's sick, you cut the dead wood out and inject it, fertilize it, say some prayers.
Yeah, I've seen all kinds of things. Magic crystals, they came into play in one neighborhood in Austin once. Seriously. Yeah, the pruning is probably not going to do a lot of good, except it's going to make the tree look better. And I would inject it first and then prune. We usually recommend well, anyway, let me get back. Pruning this out doesn't usually do a lot of good. You're not going to help the system. So just the injection. Yes.
Okay, we're talking about oak wilt. What about those beetles? What bird likes to eat those beetles?
Probably more like what bat likes to eat.
Oh, bat. So we can encourage them.
So this is a very good question. So the number one way to control Dutch elm disease is spray the tree with insecticide. So why don't we recommend that with oak wilt? It's because of one thing that I said up there that probably just went over everybody's head. They're opportunistic. It means that they really don't seem to have any stake in the game that we can determine. And when you have an insect that doesn't have a stake in the game, like the Dutch elm disease beetle, which every tree is a breeding ground for new beetles, that doesn't happen. These fungal mats are so rare anyway that the knitted-dulid beetles don't rely on fungal mats. If they did, we wouldn't have any knitted-dulid beetles. And because of this opportunistic nature, it makes them very, very difficult to control. Because you don't have any way to get at them. You don't have any way to predict when and where they're going to go. And you can't stand there. If you've got a red oak that becomes diseased, you could, if you wanted to, keep watching that tree at the end of the summer and then come out every day in the spring and watch until it forms fungal mats and then control the mats. But why don't you just cut the tree down the previous year, because it's going to die. It's not going to make it anyway. So why mess with it? Why let it stand there? That's why a lot of communities out here do have ordinances that you have to remove a diseased red oak, and they are enforced. Yes.
Is the mat the only place these beetles breed, or is there other places?
Oh no, they'll breed anywhere. They'll, like I said.
So there's nothing you can do to
That's,
eradicate.
yeah, you can't get a handle on it. It's like with mosquitoes, they go out and get the tires of water and get the water out of your backyard. That we don't have any prescription for knitted-dulid beetles because they're just so pervasive and so opportunistic and taking advantage of well, I used to find them. You can find them on crushed cactus. When I'm rolling across the range in the pickup and you crush the cactus down, you come out the next day, you'll see knitted-dulid beetles starting to be attracted to it.
About your compost pile, would that be a?
I'll bet it would. Yeah, you're putting fruits and vegetables out. You know, I never thought of that. Absolutely. Yes. I have never thought about that. I'm gonna put a new one on there. No composting. That'll make me popular.
Not around your oak tree anyway.
No.
Or you put a back house right there by it.
Or you get, or get a bath house. I mean, I can do this the rest of the afternoon. Do you have another speaker?
At 3:30, so.
3:30. Well, I'll leave it up to y'all. If you,
Or maybe people want to come.
I'm going to a winery from here. For work. It is, it's for work. That's my next destination. I've got insect traffic going on in some of the vineyards near here, so, yes.
So you've got, I have a red oak and I have a non-red oak not far from it. How big do the trees need to be before you treat them?
Okay, so that's a very good question. You can, I would say that once they get up to 2 to 3 inches. However, you don't inject a tree unless it is at very, very high risk. I didn't say this, and I should have. Remember I said when it gets to the neighbor's yard, that's when you go ahead and inject the tree. You don't want to inject a tree if it's a quarter mile away, because by the time it finally works its way to your tree through the root systems, you're going to have to re-inject it again anyway. And we don't inject trees for beetle transmission. And I'm taking a beating on this. I recommended that one time. There's a big tree in Fredericksburg. It has a lot of history with LBJ. It's down on the southwest side of town. And you could see Oak Wilt across the way. Looked like it was about a quarter mile away. And they said, we want to treat this tree. And we don't treat it for beetles because what I say is don't wound it. Just don't wound the tree and you don't have to treat it. But that is the only time in 40 years I said, yeah, all right, go ahead and inject it. Just be aware that you may be injecting the tree and it'll never get challenged by the beetle and you've wasted your money. That's why if you're in the neighborhood with a lot of oak trees and you can inject your tree every year, sooner or later the neighbor's going to say, "Why are you spending $300 a year on that tree?" Nobody in the neighborhood has Oak Wilt. It doesn't make sense to inject trees unless you are absolutely certain that they are going to be infected, that they are at high risk. Yes.
So you said major highways like 35 and I-10 will stop it.
But because there's no root connection.
Well, I understand that, but I mean, I got my street out there.
Okay.
That's what
Yeah.
will it jump that?
Yes, it will jump streets. Now, I know that when they get communities together that dig trenches, they will get out the history of where the water lines are put, and then they'll look and see how deep they were and what year they were put in, and then they will make some assumptions about, well, there was a 10-inch water line down the middle of this road put in 5 years ago, so that's probably an effective trench. So you can rely on that, but for most of the common streets around here, and we've got native oaks, the putting in the streets did not kill that root system underneath the street. So it just goes from one tree to the next through the neighborhood. Sidewalks, driveways, that sort of thing, don't effectively stop it. Yes. It's like I outlasted.
Just one quick, how fast does it spread?
75 feet a year. And that's regardless of tree diameters. That's another thing about live oak. In Michigan, they have a formula that they can look at the diameters of the trees and the inner tree distance, and they will be able to predict how long it's going to take to go from one tree to the next. We can't do that here because we've got common root system, and the common root system just blows that out. We tried it, it just doesn't work.
Is there anywhere you can go
and know where the oak wilt is, so you can kind of look and see, am I in a line to become infected?
Yeah, it's a great question. There used to be, I don't think it's available anymore. And you can imagine how magnificently difficult it is to keep up with that sort of thing. And we did have the money to do it at one time, but once the money goes away, you just can't keep it up. And now what I would do if I were you is go to texasoakwilt.org and just put in Texas Forest Service Oak Wilt. You'll get their website and look and see if that tool is still up. They used to have it up, and you could put in what county you're in, what town you're in, and they would have maps of where the oak wilt is. We used to do aerial flights several times every summer for every year for years, but it's just too expensive. Yes.
Just to add on to that, if you belong to an HOA or a POA, a lot of times they will let you know how close it is, if it's in your subdivision
Okay.
and where it is. So
That's
they
good.
can
That's
kind
good.
of
Yeah.
know that.
And if you, again, go to the certified arborists, those people know generally where the oak wilt is in the county. Yeah, and if they've taken the training, they're pretty reliable. We can vouch for most of them, not all of them certainly, but we can vouch for most of them. Because it's expensive and it takes a fair amount of time for them to get the training. So they're making it from
Satellite pictures.
You can, yeah, we've used everything from fixed wing aircraft to satellite imagery. Now there's a problem with that. The really good stuff you have to pay a lot of money for. TINRIS, Texas Natural Resource Information System, has color infrared photography satellite imagery available. Usually it only gets flown like once every 5 years at most. And so you're going to miss some. And also, in order to download it, play with it, you have to have some pretty sophisticated geographic information. But it can be done. You can actually get a free GIS that will handle it. It's kind of awkward and clumsy, but it will handle the databases that they have.
Will Global Earth or Google Earth, I mean, show you?
Well, to the extent that they retake the photographs, so it's going to be out of date as well.
Because usually they do.
Some areas on Google Earth still go back to the 90s practically. It just depends on where it is, whether they've updated your imagery or not. But you'll be, and it's harder, it's easier to pick out on fossil color infrared than it is on true color, which Google Earth is true color. Because you can get it confused with other tree problems things.
Yeah, that's true.
It's a little harder to tell.
Wow, I learned a lot.
Good, good.